proposals. Jenny Jones is a Green member of the London Assembly and believes the plan could destroy the social mix of some of our cities. Do you accept, though, that if you sold off some of these bigger properties, you would have the money to perhaps house people who are on the council list at the moment, and the taxpayer wouldn't have to dip into his or her pocket?
Well, the fact is that councils already do this. If they've got a very expensive, say, one-bedroom flat, they'll often sell that and put in perhaps a three-bedroom flat somewhere else. What this is actually doing is, you said earlier, it's thinking the unthinkable, but when you think the unthinkable, you have to think about what happens after you've sold it. It's all very well to go into this with pound signs in front of your eyes, but you've got to realise there are other costs. For example, there's an economic cost. If you do this, you actually push the poor further out into London. That means there's going to be pressure on fares, for example. They're going to find it incredibly difficult to get into work, to empty bins, to nurse, to teach or whatever. And also a social cost, that you start to purge places of a particular part of society, which I think is extremely unhealthy.
Purging certain people out of certain areas. I mean, does that worry you? Do you think that rich people and poor people relatively should be living in the same street? Is that a good thing?
I mean, Jenny's description isn't the London I recognise. The London I recognise is that you get considerable contrast in property values over just a very small area, just a couple of streets.
And is that a good thing, though?
Yes, I think so. And in my borough of Hammersmith and Fulham, we can get a council house becoming vacant, which we would then sell in Parsons Green, for perhaps £1 million, and that's money that could pay for several new homes actually within our borough, because certain other parts around White City, around Wilmot Scrubs, are much cheaper. And even in more expensive, even Kensington, you've got a huge range within North Kensington and so on. So it's straightforwardly bonkers to have £1 million council houses, even if you wanted to have more of a restriction than the policy exchange paper and say that the replacement housing should be within a local authority. You can still do that. And yes, some councils are doing it. My council are doing it. Some Labour councils are doing it. Southwark, but not nearly enough. And there's a great opportunity here to provide more housing, to cut the waiting lists, and the government should be giving councils a nudge to get on with it.
So straightforwardly bonkers to have people living in £1 million council houses when most people in this country can't afford to live like that.
I think that in some places that will obviously be true, but at the same time, if people have big families, if they need more bedrooms, then they are going to need houses of that size at some point. You can't just cram them into smaller houses. There's also the fact it's incredibly anti-democratic. I mean, councils are elected to make decisions for themselves. If they're already doing this in some places...
But you need a nudge. Am I right in saying that your point was you need to give councils a nudge to free up this money?
I don't think so. I think councils are already thinking... I mean, the government is starving councils of money, and so councils, I think, are being very creative at the moment about how to find more money. But this, I think, could be potentially a disaster. It would make us more like Paris, where there are huge differences within
But
Paris.
your answer to the housing crisis is to spend more public money to ask the taxpayer to fund it. That's basically it, isn't it?
I think
that was in the Green Manifesto.
Well,
£4 billion a year last year was what you would have planned to spend.
This isn't only about public money, in fact.
But it would have
it's
been
not only
public
about
money,
social housing, it's also about housing associations, who at the moment make their own decisions and do what they can, and so the government would be forcing councils and housing associations.
It's anti-localism, which you say you stand for.
Associations are charities, and a good point made in the policy exchange paper was that really, as charities, they should be under an obligation to get the best possible value, and the indulgence of a housing association absolutely scandalous if hanging on to properties worth £1 million, multi-million pounds. One other thing I'd just like to mention is that we've got a large number of empty properties in this country, including a large number owned by local councils in disrepair. We've got to take a random example, Brighton and Hove, where the council's run by the Green Party, 250 empty council-owned properties there, many derelict. Some of those they should be selling and getting empty properties done up.
But don't you worry that one consequence of this is what happens in Paris, which is basically rich people live in the middle, poor people live on the outside, and they have to commute in, and that's the recipe for some of the riots people say in Paris.
No, I think that what would be good for social cohesion would be if we reduced the waiting list. We had fewer people in temporary accommodation and hostels. We had a smaller number of empty council-owned properties that are derelict, and we had some economic reality and some sense of the policy.
I mean, having a house is better than having no house, even if you have to commute anywhere in Britain.
I wouldn't disagree with the idea of actually using properties better, because often there are people who are in three-bedroom houses who don't need to be in them and so on. So that's absolutely true. But all of those things are already being done. What I would have liked to have seen, if you're thinking big, why not come up with a big idea that actually has a little less a little less attack on the poor and a little bit more creative thinking? For example, something like a land value tax. If you're driving people away from their communities, away from their homes, away from their houses, away from their children's schools.
These are people who don't have houses. These are people on the waiting list.
And if you
asking their councillors for homes, and which is a policy to provide them with the housing they need. It's not an attack on the poor.
Further out of London, that actually makes life much more difficult for them.
We'll leave it there. Thank you both very much. Thank you.